October 23, 1944, 0745 hours. Abandoned garrison compound, Leyte, Philippines. Kim Sun-hee pressed herself against the bamboo wall, listening to boots crunching across the compound yard. For 3 years, those sounds had meant violence was coming. But these footsteps were different, heavier, more deliberate, accompanied by voices speaking a language she didn't recognize. Through the crack in the wall, she glimpsed olive-drab uniforms instead of the familiar khaki of her captors. American soldiers moved cautiously through the abandoned buildings, their weapons lowered but ready. When one approached her hiding place, Sun-hee closed her eyes and prepared for whatever came next. "Ma'am?" The voice was gentle, uncertain. "It's okay. We're Americans. You're safe now." For women who had survived years in Japan's comfort station system, liberation came not as triumph, but as disbelief. The shocking discovery that survival was possible, that dignity could be restored, and that strangers could offer kindness after years of systematic cruelty. The system of exploitation. The military comfort station system had operated across the Japanese Empire since 1932, forcibly recruiting women from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied territories. Tens of thousands of young women, many still teenagers, had been deceived with promises of factory work or simply abducted from their homes and transported to remote military installations. The stations followed a brutal organizational pattern designed to isolate victims from any possibility of escape or rescue. Located in military compounds far from civilian populations, surrounded by guards, and operated under strict secrecy, they created conditions of total control over the women trapped within them. By 1944, as American forces advanced through the Pacific, these facilities had spread throughout the Japanese Empire. From Manchuria to the Solomon Islands, wherever Japanese military units required services that command considered essential for troop morale and discipline. The women held in these places had been told repeatedly that no one would ever come for them, that the outside world had forgotten them, and that death was their only escape. The psychological conditioning was as systematic as the physical control, breaking down hope until survival itself seemed impossible. The approach of liberation as American forces swept through Japanese-held territories in 1944 and 1945, they began discovering evidence of the comfort station system. Intelligence reports mentioned women being held at military installations, but the full scope and nature of their captivity only became clear when actual liberation occurred. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hayes commanded the 32nd Infantry Regiment's advance through Leyte. His unit had expected to find Japanese military personnel and possibly civilian laborers at enemy installations. The discovery of Korean and Chinese women at the first compound they secured shocked even veteran soldiers who thought they had seen everything warfare could produce. "We found them hiding in the back buildings," Hayes reported to division headquarters. "Dozens of young women, clearly not Filipino. They were terrified of us, wouldn't come out until our medics approached slowly and offered food. It took hours to convince them we weren't going to hurt them." The women's reaction to liberation revealed the psychological damage of prolonged captivity under a system designed to break their will to resist or hope for rescue. Years of conditioning had taught them that all soldiers represented threat, that any change in circumstances likely meant worse treatment rather than improvement. The first contact. The initial encounters between liberating American forces and comfort station survivors required extraordinary patience and sensitivity. Women who had learned that survival depended on complete submission were incapable of immediately trusting their apparent rescuers. Private Daniel Martinez was among the first soldiers to enter the compound where Sun-hee and 15 other women had been held. His Spanish language skills allowed basic communication with the Filipino women, while hand gestures and tone of voice had to suffice for the Korean and Chinese survivors. They wouldn't look at us directly, Martinez recalled decades later. They knelt on the ground with their heads down, like they were waiting for orders or punishment. When I tried to help one woman stand up, she flinched away like I was going to hit her. It broke your heart. The women's responses revealed conditioning that had taught them to interpret any male attention as prelude to violence. Their bodies bore evidence of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and diseases that had gone without medical care. More devastating was the psychological damage, the systematic destruction of self-worth and hope that the comfort station system had been designed to achieve. The medical crisis. Army medical personnel who examined the liberated women documented conditions that shocked even experienced military doctors. Malnutrition was universal, with many women weighing less than 80 pounds. Untreated sexually transmitted diseases, infected wounds, and evidence of repeated physical trauma required immediate medical intervention. Captain Helen Morrison, an Army nurse assigned to the evacuation hospital at Tacloban, found herself caring for women whose medical needs exceeded anything her training had prepared her to handle. Beyond the physical damage was psychological trauma that manifested in behaviors that made treatment difficult. They wouldn't undress for examination, wouldn't eat the food we offered, wouldn't sleep lying down, Morrison documented in her medical notes. They had been conditioned to expect that any interaction with authority figures would involve pain or humiliation. Gaining their trust required patience we didn't always have time for. The medical team developed protocols specifically for treating comfort station survivors, recognizing that standard medical procedures could trigger traumatic responses. Examinations were conducted only by female personnel when possible, with cultural interpreters present to explain medical procedures and obtain meaningful consent for treatment. The language of healing communication barriers created additional challenges in providing care to women who spoke Korean, Chinese, and various Filipino dialects. The liberation forces included few personnel who could speak these languages, requiring creative approaches to establish basic understanding and trust. Sergeant Grace Kimura, a Japanese-American interpreter with the Military Intelligence Service, became crucial in communicating with some survivors. Her ability to speak Japanese allowed her to translate for Korean women who had been forced to learn that language during their captivity. They were shocked to see a Japanese face speaking with American soldiers, Kimura recalled. At first, they thought I was another trap, another form of control. But when I spoke to them in Korean and explained that I was American, that my family was from Hawaii, it began to break through the fear. The process of establishing communication revealed the cultural complexity of the survivors' backgrounds. Many had been taken from their homes as teenagers and held for years in isolation that prevented them from maintaining their native languages or cultural practices. The comfort station system had deliberately attempted to erase their identities along with their freedom. The gradual recognition. The realization that liberation was genuine rather than another form of deception took days or weeks to penetrate the psychological defenses that had enabled survival under captivity. Small gestures of kindness, clean clothing, hot food, medical attention, slowly demonstrated that their circumstances had fundamentally changed. Maria Santos, a Filipino woman held at a station on Mindanao, later described the moment when she began to believe that freedom was real. An American nurse brought me soap and clean water, then left me alone to wash. She didn't watch, didn't give orders, just walked away. For the first time in 3 years, I had privacy. That's when I knew something had really changed. The respect for privacy and personal autonomy represented by such simple acts stood in stark contrast to the total surveillance and control that had defined their captivity. The gradual recognition that they could make choices, what to eat, when to sleep, how to spend their time, required psychological adjustment that took months to achieve. The testimony of dignity. As survivors began to trust their liberators, they shared accounts of survival that revealed extraordinary resilience and mutual support under conditions designed to destroy human dignity. The women had developed networks of care and protection that had enabled some to survive when others perished. The friendships and alliances formed during captivity had provided psychological lifelines that made survival possible. Older women had protected younger ones when possible, sharing scarce food and providing emotional support during the darkest periods. These bonds often transcended ethnic and linguistic differences, creating communities of survival that sustained hope when individual hope failed. Chung Sun-mi, a Korean woman liberated on Okinawa, testified about the mutual support that had enabled survival. "We became sisters in suffering." The Chinese woman, Li Meiling, shared her rice when I was sick. The Filipina girl, Rosa, taught us to weave baskets to occupy our minds. Without each other, we would have died, not from physical causes, but from losing the will to live. The medical recovery. The physical rehabilitation of comfort station survivors required specialized medical protocols that addressed both immediate health crises and long-term recovery needs. Army medical units developed treatment programs specifically designed for women whose health had been systematically damaged by prolonged abuse and neglect. Nutritional rehabilitation proceeded slowly, as women whose digestive systems had been compromised by chronic malnutrition couldn't immediately tolerate normal diets. Medical personnel learned to provide small, frequent meals with nutrients specifically chosen to rebuild depleted body systems without causing additional distress. The treatment of psychological trauma required approaches that military medicine was only beginning to understand. Standard psychiatric protocols proved inadequate for addressing trauma that combined sexual violence, cultural displacement, and prolonged captivity under conditions of total powerlessness. The cultural restoration efforts to restore cultural identity and dignity to comfort station survivors involved more than medical treatment. American forces worked with local communities and international relief organizations to provide cultural and linguistic support that helped women reconnect with their identities. Korean survivors were provided with traditional Korean foods when available, clothing that reflected their cultural background, and opportunities to practice cultural activities that had been forbidden during captivity. Similar efforts were made for Chinese, Filipina, and other survivors to help them reclaim aspects of identity that the comfort station system had attempted to erase. Religious services in appropriate languages and cultural traditions provided spiritual support that many survivors identified as crucial to their recovery. The ability to practice their faith freely after years of prohibition represented a fundamental restoration of human dignity that transcended immediate physical needs. The Repatriation Challenge. As the war ended, the complex process of repatriating comfort station survivors to their home countries revealed additional challenges. Many women feared returning to communities that might reject them because of their experiences, while others discovered that their families had been killed or displaced during the war. Some survivors chose to remain in the Philippines or other locations rather than return to homelands where they expected to face social stigma. The shame associated with sexual violence in traditional Asian cultures meant that many women could never publicly acknowledge their experiences or seek community support for their trauma. American authorities worked with international relief organizations to provide options for survivors who couldn't or wouldn't return home. These efforts included resettlement assistance, vocational training, and ongoing medical care for women whose recovery would require years of support. The witness accounts. American personnel who participated in liberating comfort stations provided testimony that documented both the horror of what they discovered and their admiration for the strength of the survivors. These accounts became crucial historical evidence of war crimes that some sought to deny or minimize. Captain Morrison wrote in her official report, These women survived conditions that would have broken most people. Their courage in rebuilding their lives after liberation demonstrated resilience that inspired everyone involved in their care. They weren't just victims, they were survivors who refused to be defeated by what they had endured. Dachau warriors. The military personnel who witnessed the liberation consistently emphasized the dignity and strength that survivors displayed once they began to trust their rescuers. Rather than broken victims, they encountered women who had maintained their humanity under conditions designed to destroy it. The long-term recovery. The psychological recovery of comfort station survivors proved to be a lifelong process that required ongoing support and understanding. Many women struggled with trauma-related symptoms for decades after liberation, while others found ways to transform their experiences into advocacy for other survivors of wartime sexual violence. Some survivors became advocates for recognition of comfort women as victims of war crimes, working to ensure that their experiences would be documented and remembered. Their testimony provided crucial evidence for historical understanding of the comfort station system and its impact on tens of thousands of women across Asia. Others chose privacy and anonymity, seeking to rebuild their lives without public attention to their wartime experiences. Both choices represented valid responses to trauma, and efforts to support survivors respected their right to determine how their stories would be shared or protected. The historical recognition. The liberation of comfort stations by American forces provided the first international documentation of Japan's systematic sexual slavery program. Military reports, medical records, and witness testimony created an official record that would later support efforts to achieve historical recognition and justice for survivors. The immediate response of American military personnel, providing medical care, ensuring safety, and treating survivors with dignity, established precedents for humanitarian response to wartime sexual violence that influenced later international humanitarian law and military protocols. The discovery that organized sexual slavery had been an integral part of Japanese military operations shocked American officials and contributed to post-war efforts to establish international legal frameworks preventing such systematic abuse during armed conflicts. The personal transformations, individual stories of recovery and rebuilding revealed the extraordinary resilience of women who refused to allow their wartime experiences to define their entire lives. Many survivors went on to marry, raise families, and contribute to their communities in ways that demonstrated the triumph of human dignity over systematic oppression. Sun Hee, who had hidden in the bamboo wall that October morning in 1944, eventually settled in Seoul, where she worked as a seamstress and raised 3 children. She never spoke publicly about her wartime experiences, but her family knew her strength had been forged in survival that required courage beyond ordinary understanding. Her daughter later wrote, "My mother never told us details about the war, but we could see the strength in her hands when she worked, the gentleness in her voice when she sang, the determination in her eyes when she faced difficulties. Whatever she had survived had made her stronger, not weaker." The continuing legacy. The shock that comfort women experienced upon liberation, discovering that survival was possible, that dignity could be restored, that strangers could show kindness, provided foundation for decades of advocacy and education about wartime sexual violence. Survivors who chose to speak publicly about their experiences became voices for historical truth and international justice. Their courage in breaking silence about sexual violence during warfare contributed to global recognition that such crimes are offenses against humanity itself, not merely unfortunate byproducts of military conflict. The American soldiers who first encountered these women learned lessons about human resilience that many carried throughout their lives. The discovery that systematic sexual slavery had been official policy rather than individual criminal behavior shaped American understanding of war crimes and the need for international accountability. The dignity restored. The liberation of comfort stations represented more than military victory. It was the restoration of human dignity to women who had been systematically dehumanized by policies designed to reduce them to objects for military use. The shock of liberation lay not just in survival, but in the gradual recognition that they were seen as human beings deserving of respect and care. The simple act of offering food without demanding payment, providing medical care without conditions, and allowing privacy without surveillance represented revolutionary changes for women who had known only exploitation and control. These basic human courtesies became proof that different forms of human relationship were possible. The enduring testimony. Decades after liberation, the testimonies of comfort, women survivors continued to provide crucial historical evidence about the systematic nature of wartime sexual violence and the extraordinary resilience of women who survived it. Their stories serve as warnings about the consequences of dehumanizing policies and inspiration about the possibility of healing and recovery. The shock of liberation that these women experienced, the disbelief that freedom was possible, that kindness could replace cruelty, that dignity could be restored, stands as testimony to both the horror of what they endured and the strength that enabled them to survive and rebuild their lives. Their legacy lies not in the victimization they suffered, but in the courage they demonstrated in surviving, in speaking truth about their experiences, and in refusing to allow systematic oppression to destroy their fundamental humanity. The moment of liberation was just the beginning of lifelong journeys toward healing that demonstrated the power of human resilience over organized cruelty. In remembering their shock at liberation, we honor not just their suffering, but their strength, not just their victimization, but their victory over those who sought to destroy their spirits. Their survival became their resistance, their healing became their triumph, and their testimony became their gift to future generations who must ensure that such systematic dehumanization never occurs again.